reader, Joey Murphy,
last reader of the year,
going out with a bang, is a fourth-year MFA student in creative nonfiction. The first thing she was told in a workshop here at Pitt was that memoir was stupid and memoirs about mothers were really stupid. She just printed out her memoir about her mother and turned it in.
In junior high, we were stuck between conflicting views of how mature we were. Mrs. Vader consistently overestimated our worldliness, and still others saw us as young children. We had a mathematics teacher who was so old she had to be semi-carried to her classroom each day by two strong 8th grade boys. They would gently place her on a stool at the front of the classroom, where with the aid of an overhead projector and Kleenex and some markers, she taught. Sister Hubertha was so old that her skin looked like tissue paper, and her blue eyes were cloudy and wet. She was so afflicted with arthritis that her hands only worked as pincers, thumb opposite a wall of fingers that were spatulate and fused together. Her tiny feet were so tortured that her orthopedic shoes appeared to be on the wrong legs. She was so ancient that she scared us a little. We spoke more softly in her room and walked with greater care when called to her podium, afraid to even jostle the air lest we hurt her. In her room, we were suddenly aware of the damage our growing and awkward bodies could cause. She spoke to us, really almost sang to us from another era entirely. You could hear the creak of wagon wheels and the clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones when she spoke. Cherubs? She would address us with tenderness when pleased. Attend to the overhead now. Born in 1908 in the home of her immigrant maternal grandmother, Margaret Murphy, Sister's birth certificate actually read Mary P. Leindecker. Mrs. Murphy owned the house on Jones Avenue in Braddock where the family lived. Sister Hubertha, who was called Rosalie by her family, grew up under the thick canopy of smoke belched out by the Edgar Thomson Steel Works. Her German father's family had been several generations in Pittsburgh, and he's listed as having been a carpenter and a check man at the mill. A skilled man, he would have provided a steadier, brighter life for his family than the dismal one of a regular mill laborer. I can only imagine that young Rosalie must have been especially cherished and wildly talented, because at that time, it was unusual for boys or girls to progress beyond the 8th grade. Rosalie would have entered the School Sisters of Notre Dame and been sent to normal school at around age 15. The 1930 census finds her in New York City attending Fordham. The census entry itself is a worthy historical document. It lists each of the 177 sisters in residence as actual siblings, with the Mother Superior listed as their mother. Rosalie completed her bachelor's at the College of Notre Dame in Maryland and taught until the late 1980s. I believe she was one of the dearest and most remarkable women that I've ever met. She always seemed oblivious to the discomfort that her physical ailments wrought, though we squirmed simply from looking at her twisted limbs. We hunched and tried to make ourselves smaller around her, which caused her to lecture us almost daily on the importance of good posture. Poor posture was one of the few things that might make her feel very peevish. She would be very peevish about that as she drilled us on the concept of area, using puzzles and word problems left over from the days when girls cut fabric bolts and made pattern dresses, and boys routinely needed to calculate board feet. Sister was legendary for the perfect discipline in her classroom. Back straight, feet on the floor, there was never any guessing in her room. If we made her a little peaked, she addressed us as scholars. But even when cross, her wavering voice communicated a mix of tenderness and an expectation of excellence. She never doubted that we could master her mathematics. The possibility simply didn't exist. For cherubs like me, she knew the best tactic was rote memorization. I didn't need to understand it just yet. I just needed to do it, child. Follow the steps, I'd understand later. This turned out to be excellent insight, not just for math, but for life. Her gentleness, I imagine, came from the fact that we did, from the distance of her great age, resemble cherubs. I believe that to her eyes, we were just fuzzy little hatchlings, just scrawny-limbed, giant-eyed peeps. Our individual features were still blurry with youth, and when she spoke to us, she addressed us as blobs of potential, not yet people. How could we fail at something? How could we be bad? We were babies. She had aged out of any individual defining features or desires and simply continued to exist because someone had to teach the children their repeating decimal remainders. She was the only person other than my even more antique paternal grandmother who I had ever heard use the word dascent, and because I could never imagine myself so content with my lot in life, so focused on humbly giving to people who were simply too young to understand her sacrifice. She was dedicated to her work to the point of keeping on, though her body had failed her, and I think of her daily. Her tenderness brought out our tenderness in an extraordinary way one day in the 7th grade. There was a shuffling of classes to accommodate a teacher's sick day, and a combined group of us, 7th and 8th graders, were sent to Sister Hubertha for a study hall. It was unprecedented in a number of ways, and our little antenna sensed that something had gone really wrong, schedule-wise. The unusual mix of students meant that Sister was meeting a handful of 8th graders that she'd never met before. Robert was one of those students. Robert had a terrible case of scoliosis, and one was unable to stand up straight. His tall, skinny frame curled like a comma from the middle of his back. All the kids in school knew that he wore a brace and was excused from gym class. Robert also had a terrible case of acne and a deep love of heavy metal, which combined to give him a rather furtive air as he tried to hide himself in the back row. There wasn't any work for us to do in this study hall, so we were to sit there with our feet flat on the floor, our hands flat on the desk, and our backs straight in our chairs. It wasn't a punishment. Sister really believed that practicing good posture was fundamental for our development. Robert, of course, couldn't sit up in his chair, and Sister might have been a little more piqued that day than usual. She wasn't usually in the school so late in the day. The sight of Robert slumped in his desk struck her as an affront. Not to her, mind you, but to God. How dare a healthy young body insult the Creator by abusing His work and slouching? The Lord didn't care for a slouch, no sir, not at all. Why, didn't we know she would give anything to stand up straight and strong if her frail body allowed her to? She would love to. Didn't we know the effort she put into getting herself to the classroom each day so that she could serve God and Pythagoras? How dare he slouch in front of her? She summoned Robert to the front of the room. Why, you'd be quite the tall chap if you'd just stand up straight. Stand up straight, she commanded, not unkindly. Robert visibly pushed his back against the chalkboard, feebly, to try and show he was at least trying. Not satisfied with his efforts, Sister slowly lowered herself down from her stool and hobbled the few steps to where Robert stood. We gasped as she placed the knuckles of one of her pincher hands against his shoulders and shoved Robert until he was against the board. See now what a tall fellow you are? Her pleasure faded as Robert deflated back into a slouch the moment she removed her restraining claw from his shoulder. Are you playing at being afflicted, boy? We were frozen in our seats. For starters, We'd never seen Sister walk unescorted before, and she seemed impossibly precarious to us. I was aware of holding my breath. Secondly, treating Robert with kindness and respect was a school-wide mandate. That mandate, however, was trumped, even for Robert, by the unspoken mandate to be extra kind and good to Sister Hubertha. She was a precious relic. Sister pushed Robert's shoulder a second time, and then a third and fourth time, as Robert's spine collapsed again and again into a curve. Not one of us said a word. Not a soul among us had the heart to tell her that Robert was legitimately handicapped. Robert couldn't even bring himself to embarrass her in such a way. Robert couldn't stand to be looked at, couldn't stand to be the center of attention. Yet he stood there, turning purple with a stoicism that no 13-year-old boy should have been able to manage, as Sister shoved him one last time with all of her might, finally upending herself. The next minute played out in cruel slow motion, and our hearts broke to see her land helpless on the floor. Robert stood still as a statue, and we sat rigid with our hands flat on our desks and our feet flat on the floor, torn between staying seated as instructed and rushing to Sister, and also terrified of even trying to help her, lest we make things worse for her fragile self. We did not whisper, we did not giggle, we did not think any of it was funny. A few of us teared up. I remember being proud of us and proud of Robert, but proudest of all of the level-headed girl that finally ran to the office for help. So, thank you guys.